It may feel like in these strange times we're in a bit of a mess. We've had a plague, the COVID-19 crisis. We've had a war that is ongoing. We've had floods. We've had fires. I'm not sure we've had pestilence yet, but maybe we have had that too. So it's a difficult moment. We have four big brains with a lot of great experience to help us try to navigate these geopolitical dimensions. Judith Gough is currently British ambassador to Sweden and very helpfully former ambassador to Ukraine. We're delighted to have you with us today to share your thoughts. Please do come up. Mary Warlick, Deputy Executive Director of the International Energy Agency too. Again, a huge moment for the energy system. Please do come up and join me. Abul, Kalam, Azad, Special Envoy of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, very senior Bangladeshi official, and our very own Lord Deben, the Chair of the Committee on Climate Change, and experienced, dare I say, political operator, if I may, John. So please do come and join me up on the sofas for a little bit of a comfortable discussion. So while our panelists are coming up, I just wanted to frame this a little bit. Each of them will have a little moment to share a presentation with you. But as I say, we've got a situation where we've got war in Europe, we've got a thawing of the US-Chinese axis, we're not exactly in an ideal place. Now, Judith, I'd love you to kick us off, if you will, with a bit of a mini presentation. You've had vast experience, and we're really looking forward to you sharing it. And perhaps I will save I've got so many questions to ask you, but I will save them until you've had a chance to speak to us a little bit. So let me give you the floor.
Thank you. Do you want me to speak from there?
You can either way, however you prefer.
Do it here. Lord Deben says do it here. I'm not moving. No, I mean, first of all, thank you. I was going to say it's rather nice, isn't it? Thank you very much for the invitation. And I think, it's a fascinating time to be talking about this. It's a fascinating time to be an ambassador, quite frankly. I have been very lucky to serve since 2015 as ambassador in 2 countries where it was always clear that Ukraine was going to be very interesting. It was less clear that Sweden was going to be very interesting, but my goodness, how times have changed. And I think, first of all, thank you for inviting me to speak. It's not an obvious area of expertise for a British ambassador to be talking about net zero and climate change. But actually, times have changed so significantly that every diplomat has this at the core of what they do. It is now part of our job. We weren't talking about this a few years ago. It wasn't part of the day job. But I can think of very little that has really penetrated into my working life over the last couple of years, apart from the steady drumbeat of conflict and war and death and doom and destruction and pestilence, than climate change and energy security. So it's a real pleasure to be able to talk about it. And I would signpost people to Dr. John Merton, who's sitting there very quietly on the edge, because he is the true expert in our organisation as our COP26 envoy. So when you have really expert questions, please do go to John, because he will be able to provide the answers. But I think if we're looking at what has happened in Europe, the world changed on the 24th of February. As one of my colleagues said to me, it was as if a switch had been flicked, and it really felt like that. If anybody in this room had said to me back in January, this year Sweden will increase her defence budget to 2% of GDP, she'll be sending weapons to a conflict zone, and she will be applying to NATO, I'd have asked you what you'd put in your coffee that morning. None of that was a remote possibility, and yet here we are, with an application in process. There's a Turkey issue to be sorted out, but an application in process for both Sweden and Finland. Why? Because both countries looked at what happened in Ukraine and realized that as enhanced opportunities partners, they had no more protection than Ukraine had. And Finland has an 800-mile border with Russia. That focuses minds. That's just 2 countries where we've seen the change. I mean, the UK, we're now talking about going to 3% of GDP for our defence spending. That's a huge shift. We ourselves are leading the charge with the US, providing weapons and training and support to Ukraine, and that is going to continue. Now, that is going to come at an economic and potentially a political cost. As energy prices rise, It is going to be a real challenge to convince electorates that that is a price worth paying for the freedom of a country such as Ukraine. Now, we need to win the argument that actually that's a price worth paying for the security of Europe and beyond. Because if we allow Putin to challenge the rules-based international system and change borders by force, the likelihood is we will not be holding him back in Ukraine, but we will be holding him back elsewhere. And the consequences of this conflict are really significant. And I think one of the issues that perhaps touched on in Sir Alok Sharma's speech, I think we've done very well as an international community in uniting amongst Western democracies in our action against Russia. I think we've done extremely well. Sanctions have held. They're really hard. They're really biting. The coordination on the provision of military support and humanitarian support. But we haven't so much won the argument with the rest of the world. And that's a challenge, because going forwards, these challenges are never going to remain within borders. I think for a number of countries outside of the European sphere and Japan, the conflict is a European issue. It doesn't affect us. And let's be honest, some of them have a dependency on Russia that means it is easier to ignore some of the consequences of this conflict because they may be getting a nuclear power station, for example. So I think we have to get better, not just when it comes to tackling issues such as Russia, but actually also climate change, in uniting the international community and making clear the arguments. The irony of the Russian invasion on Ukraine is that it does have a global impact, because many of the countries that have been sitting on the fence in response are those countries who are being affected by the consequent food insecurity, because we cannot get the grain and the sunflower oil out of Ukraine through the port of Odessa. So we need to get better as diplomats at listening and understanding other countries' priorities. We need to, in a time of increased fragility and global fragility, understand that we need to work outside the traditional groupings. The G7 has been a great motor for change and has been a great motor for pushing responses to global problems, but it can't be the sole answer. We have to find a better way of including others. Just in terms of, because I know you're going to ask lots of questions about Russia going to Ukraine. I don't know where you want me to go. But I think, a couple of points. I don't see an early end in sight to the conflict. Right. I spent 4 years in Ukraine. I can tell you the Ukrainians are going to fight. Yeah. Why? Because right is on their side. They want to exist as a sovereign nation. They have every right to do so. Putin yesterday, you will have seen, made a speech where he announced a partial mobilization of an initial 300,000 men and made some threats about nuclear weapons. This man is not coming from a position of strength. He is coming from a position of weakness. Otherwise, he would have gone for full mobilization, so he has an internal domestic problem. But actually, he hasn't made the gains that he wanted to in Ukraine. Let's be clear, he wanted the entire country. He didn't get that, and in fact, he's being pushed back at every step. That does mean we are at a moment of potential peril, because he may choose to escalate vertically, and we have to send very clear signals that he should not do this. But we are not going to see an early end to this. And even if we do, the reconstruction of Ukraine and the consequences of this action are going to be felt for many years to come. Energy security. Putin's a good tactician, but strategically this is disastrous. There is no faster incentive to transition to renewables than weaning yourself off Russian oil and gas. Let's be really honest. We should have seen this coming, and I think a number of people did, but there are a number of countries who felt that by embedding Russian into their energy supply, they could trade with Russia and bring Russia into the international community through trade. That was never going to be the case, and we shouldn't be surprised that subsequently energy has been used as a tool and a weapon. The Kremlin was doing this back in the late 80s when the Baltic states were trying to assert their independence. This is not new. We should have always been alert to the fact that Russia was going to use energy as a major instrument. So in some ways, he's helped us out because we have Putin to thank for the NATO alliance being strengthened with Sweden and Finland joining. We have Putin to thank for hopefully speeding up the transition away from hydrocarbons. And we have Putin to thank actually for uniting an international community in a way perhaps where we saw there were divisions beforehand.
Great. Well, I want to come in a moment to Mary on the consequences of this for energy security, and does it accelerate, does it delay the transition to net zero? But before I do, I'll just allow myself one of the dozen questions in my mind, Judith, for you. If you project forwards 3 or 4 months to what could be a pretty bitter winter all round, it's potentially difficult for Europeans who are going to be paying all these high prices or perhaps have rationing. It's potentially difficult for the Ukrainians to be fighting, and they're also reliant upon gas. It's also potentially difficult for the Russians, because we've seen the protests already. Who is it more difficult for? And where does that leave us in January or February? I mean, it's difficult to anticipate, but where do you think we'll be?
I think it depends on how you define difficulty. I've lived in Russia, I've lived in Ukraine, I've lived in the UK occasionally as well. The threshold for pain in Russia and Ukraine amongst the general population is far higher than our threshold for pain, for all sorts of reasons, but mostly for historical reasons. That is partly why Putin has remained in power. People have been prepared to endure for the sake of what they see him as having brought security and stability. I don't think you can suffer more pain than Ukraine is currently suffering at the moment. I mean, if you look at it, we haven't yet, sadly, heard the worst of all of the atrocities. As Ukraine rolls Russia back, which we hope they will continue to do, we're going to find more. So I think that pain is already factored in to Ukraine. I think it's very striking that actually the Russian threshold for pain appears to be eroding. If you look at any of the... if you wanted to buy an air ticket out of Moscow yesterday, you will have struggled to do so, because the immediate result of the announcement of mobilization saw lots of young men heading for anywhere outside of Russia that they could. They don't want to fight. It's Operation Certain Death. So I think there's a real crunch point coming for Putin. Now, I'm not predicting at the moment that he's going to be deposed, but I think Russia is looking more fragile. And if an unraveling comes, it could be very swift. I think for our own societies, it's going to be very difficult indeed. We are not used to having to confront some of the high rates of inflation, potential impacts on our energy supply. It sort of reminds me, I won't tell you how old I am, but it sort of reminds me of when I was very little, very, very little in the 1970s. We're looking at that again in a way that I think younger generations are not prepared for and do not have the experience of. And I think that's going to be a challenge. And politicians are going to find this hard. And of course, the narrative that this is the fault of us supporting Ukraine is going to be difficult to shake, not least because it's a narrative that Russia is actively weaponizing. So we're going to have to be on our guard against disinformation. This is not taking place in a vacuum, and it's going to require strong political leadership.
Yeah, and it's very interesting what we might be learning from the Italian elections too on this front, but let's park that one. So thank you, Judith. Mary, I'd love to come to you and to the IEA and to the energy system and what this means for the transition to net zero and for energy security. Will we go faster? Will we go slower? I've asked my 50 MBA students to answer this question. I wasn't really satisfied by any of them. I think I'm going to get the masterclass now. So, Mary, the floor is yours.
Try my best. Thank you. So, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to join you. Really pleased to be here and have the opportunity to meet so many of you here. Good to be here. I think it's evident, as I think we'd all agree, we're in the midst of what we are calling, certainly at the IEA, the first global energy crisis, and the impacts, Judith's already described them, and I know we'll hear a whole lot more about them, are really significant, no question. We've seen, high energy prices brought on by the Russian invasion. It's hurting households and consumers and businesses all over the world. And yes, some see it as a setback in terms of the global effort to tackle climate change, but we're also seeing this crisis prompting, at least in many countries, an accelerated shift to renewables, a real effort to kind of transform and strengthen energy security in a way we haven't seen before, and we see evidence of a real accelerated shift to renewables, shifting away from gas and towards more efficient options such as electric vehicles and so on. So we don't see the current crisis as by any means necessarily setting back the climate change. That said, it will require a real commitment, a real focus as never before on an uptick in investment around the world, and especially in the developing and emerging world, no question. I think it's important to look at this as potentially as a historic turning point, one that we can really seize in terms of addressing climate change and our energy security challenges. Not necessarily so dissimilar as what we saw in the 1970s, which was a pivotal turning point too for energy efficiency and so on. And we've seen, certainly in many of the major economies, some pretty significant policy responses, right? In recent weeks and months, we've seen the Repower EU plan, of course, Japan's GX Green, and most recently, the US Inflation Reduction Act. And I know I've spoken a little bit with colleagues about that, which really all combined represent the Inflation Reduction Act in particular, something like 1/3 of all spending on green recovery, potentially since COVID-19. And of course, investments in China in terms of renewables and electric vehicles continue to grow. But we really do, as I said, need to step up this effort. And then in the biggest economies, we see efforts to push really hard on clean energy. But we're far from our goals, and I think that's really important. As we look ahead even to 2030, which is not that many years off, among other goals, we need to quadruple annual additions of solar and wind. Electric vehicles need to reach 60% of car sales, and 1 in 5 buildings need to be retrofitted versus 1 in 120 today. We also need to see no new fossil fuel boilers sold beyond 2025. So there's a lot of very serious goals that need to be achieved if we're going to achieve our climate goals. And all of these measures can, though, of course, address the climate crisis and really position us much better. But the shift to net zero is also going to require building up secure clean energy supply chains. So many of today's clean energy technologies, supply chains such as solar PV, with China's share of global solar panel manufacturing now exceeding 80%, and set to rise up to more than 95% in the coming years, is just one example. And I know there's been a lot of increasing discussion about critical minerals too, and the concentration of those in just a few countries. The top 3 producers of lithium, cobalt, and rare earths, for example, control 3/4 of global output, just top 3 producers. And I think everyone's quite familiar with the concentration of cobalt in the DRC. It's 70% of the world's production at the moment. So this is an area that's going to require a lot of attention as we look ahead to building a clean energy economy, and how we position ourselves in a way that we don't create new vulnerabilities, right, in terms of energy security. And just come back to the point about the need for much more focused attention on the emerging and developing world. Absolutely essential to bring them along as part of this transition. The impacts, as was mentioned, on them of the current crises have been numerous: high food and fuel prices, among many other challenges. And there's a significant gap, an investment gap in particular, which really needs to be addressed. I know Alika Sharma mentioned this as well. But this is definitely an important area to focus on, and something that we've been doing a lot of work on at the IEA. An important role not only for public sector but for the private sector in figuring out how we can mobilize that investment and overcome some of the challenges is really important. This week, the IEA is launching something that we're calling the Cost of Capital Observatory, which takes a close look at some of the reasons behind the higher costs in emerging and developing countries, and we hope that a focus on that can help shine a light on and help countries around the world take on those challenges. So lots of challenges ahead as we're going into the winter, there's no question. And we know we're entering new geopolitical territories. Judith has outlined very well. Really important time, I think, to be focusing on cooperation globally across the world, and looking ahead to COP27 too, I think gives us an opportunity to really think about how we move the needle on the need for more international and multilateral cooperation here. Thanks.
Great remarks, thank you. And thank you for all that IEA has been doing in this area. I mean, I've been reading your work on critical minerals and on energy security. I mean, it's very, very helpful. All the different road deadlines that we have to hit on the roadmap to net zero, also very useful. Again, I've got far too much to ask you here, but maybe I will channel a better moderator than I. In fact, we have 3 superior moderators later in the day. Polita Clark, David Shookman, Fiona Harvey. I'm afraid you guys got the dud. But if I was channeling, in fact, I won't name names. If I was channeling one of them, I'd say, this is all wishful thinking, isn't it? I mean, Cameron, you want to believe, Mary, you want to believe that we're going to get to net zero. So a shock like this is going to accelerate progress. But what about, and here are a few what-abouts for you. What about the increase in coal burn in Europe to make up for we've switched back from gas to coal, higher emissions? What about India picking up Russian oil at cheaper prices and making hay? What about the breakdown of cooperation internationally in an area where we know cooperation is really helpful? What about the challenges of integrating supply chains? Because supply chains for the clean energy transition, as you and the IEA have pointed out, are more complex because they're higher tech, higher spec products, a solar panel or a wind turbine. And finally, Cameron, what about the fact that all of these critical minerals is not just the Congo, some of them are in Russia. So we've got all of these challenges. Mary, Cameron, you're just wishfully thinking that this is going to accelerate progress, when actually the brute fact is that this invasion of Ukraine, this cost of living crisis, it's diverting political attention. We are going to slow down. So I'd love you to help me answer those criticisms. What would you say?
Just a few challenges there. I mean, it's obviously very fair, very important to be looking for solutions to the immediate crises, no question. And you're right that this has surfaced, an interest really across the world. This is not only in the developing world. We see increased, oil and gas production in the U.S. and elsewhere to meet immediate needs. Europe needs gas from other sources in a way that it never has before. LNG exports are definitely picking up. And yes, we see increasing voices in the emerging and developing world, including in Africa, in favor of, understandably, the need for them to develop their own resources. So while we would acknowledge the importance of addressing the immediate and short-term needs, certainly of getting through this next winter, we do think it's really important to keep our eye on the longer-term goals as well, which means being a little bit cautious about the very long-term investments, for example, in new fossil field developments that aren't going to actually reach production, let alone be profitable for a couple of decades. Those are not going to meet the challenges that we have today, but will actually set us back even further. So it's a tricky time in terms of keeping, addressing, as I said, near-term challenges, but making sure we keep our eye on the longer-term goals and not getting set back. And just to make one last point, a big piece, in addition to the huge investment gap that I mentioned, is also the innovation and technology gap, because, and that goes along with critical minerals as well, but we do have, many of the technologies in place to get us to 2030 goals. What we don't yet have fully is all the technologies on things like low emissions fuels and batteries and so on to get us to our 2050 goals. So stepping up the investment in those areas and having governments really focus on that is also going to be critically important.
Okay, So quite a long to-do list there for the global community. You mentioned the impact on the developing world, so did Alok Sharma. And Abul, we're delighted to have you here, Special Envoy for the Climate Vulnerable. As you're seeing this sequence of crises play out, where do you see the priorities for countries like Bangladesh, and how? I mean, I was attacked on stage last week by someone from Pakistan who said, you know, you guys have to start thinking seriously about reparations because we're underwater and it's your fault. How do we start to think about what we need to do so that we end up with a transition to net zero that is just and that doesn't leave the vulnerable underwater? Absolutely, as you prefer. It's entirely up to you.
So, dear friends, answering to the question and also looking towards the developing countries, I will tell you the story of 55 vulnerable countries. How do they combat the triple jeopardize? The climate change, obviously followed by COVID, and then Russia-Ukraine war. How these vulnerable countries are being affected. You know, this summer, the whole Europe was literally baking. The USA, Death Valley, supposed to face 55 degrees Celsius, but they were underwater. As he mentioned about the Pakistan being flooded, huge loss of life. Bangladesh, inundated this year thrice. We are regularly facing the climate catastrophes. At this background, during COVID, almost all the oil companies were going to bankrupt. But the Russia and Ukraine war, now here there are heaps of money. All the country, those who used to depend on energy from others, they are in crisis, including the developed and developing country. But the good thing for the developed country, they have resources to combat this situation very quickly. But for the vulnerable countries, resources are very limited. So we are facing this trouble most. And you see, at this background, the Climate Vulnerable Forum, it's a forum of 55 countries, just took birth in 2009, but now we are 55. So they have the special agenda for the 1.5 degree, which all the countries of the globe agreed for 2 degree and preferably 1.5 degree. The good thing, Alok Sharma was leading COP26. There, almost none did tell about 2 degree. Almost all told about 1.5 degree. This is very positive thing. At the same time, this Climate Vulnerable Forum raised its voice in all the issues like loss and damage, adaptation. You know, adaptation, if you put 1 pound for adaptation, it will bring back 9 pounds. A stretch in time saves the 9 like that. And also, we asked for not only 100 billion, we asked for 500 billion in 5 years, because in the meantime, the developed country, they missed their commitment. So we told that, okay, make it 500 in 5 years. Also, this climate vulnerable country, when we saw that the countries, they did not meet their commitments, according to the Paris Agreement, after 5 years, all the countries need to review their commitment in NDC. So, from Bangladesh, we also advocated for the Dhaka-Glasgow Declaration when we requested the commitment from the developed country to face this 1.5 degree, 100 billion, 50-50, loss and damage and adaptation. And also, with this commitment, a special framework, how this commitment of 100 billion can see the face of lights. And carbon capture and carbon monitoring. The Climate Vulnerable Forum run its work with 5 Envoy. Here are 2 Envoy. One is Mr. Nasheed, who was the former president of Maldives, now the Speaker of the People's Majlis, and also Ms. Saima Wazed. We were working in 5 areas, that is the ambition, vulnerability, renewables, parliament, and one notable thing is culture, how climate vulnerable countries facing their disruption of culture in terms of the climate agendas. And these thematic ambassadors, especially, they are working in their different aspects. We had the first climate vulnerable finance ministers meeting. The issue of finance is the most important agenda. The V20, when the vulnerable countries had 20 members, but now it is 55, leaders from the globe, they were in the meeting. And Honorable Prime Minister requested have their 7 points vision, that is just transition, energy efficiency, economic gains, and the robust carbon market mechanism. Bangladesh, you all know that one of the most devastating country. This year, a small country, it was facing northeastern part with flash flood, northwestern part with drought, the middle part is inundated with floods, and the southern part, intrusion of saline water. How these 4 devastation can be faced by a developing country at the same time. So why we had the plan of Mujib Climate Prosperity Plan. Yes, you are saying the right word, the prosperity. How climate can be turned to prosperity. Normally we used to see the climate vulnerability, climate resilience, but here we put the word climate prosperity. Because we understand that we need to turn all the challenges into opportunity. In 1970, our country faced a terrible cyclone. That named is Cyclone Bola. If you look into the web, you will find it cost 500,000 to 1 million lives. In 1970, the same magnitude cyclone last 2020 during COVID, Amphan, it could take only a few dozen. Yes, we understand a single life is very precious, but see from 1 million to a few dozen. So we could have our volunteers, our resilience system. Now we think that obviously if we turn all the challenges into opportunity, then only we will be survived. Otherwise, it is an impossible proposition for our country to be there. So Bangladesh, having its energy transition in last decade from 47% coverage to 100% coverage in electricity, from 5 gigawatt electricity production to 25 gigawatt of electricity production. But at this point of time, how do we combat? So why this Mujib Climate Prosperity Plan? And in this plan, we look into the green growth, also employment, well-being, and from traditional living, also the renewable energies. Bangladesh is the home of 6.5 million solar home system, one of the biggest. A small country, no land for renewable energy, because you know, for 1 megawatt of electricity, it needs 1 hectare of land. I used to cite an example that if the population of the whole globe can be brought to USA, the population density will be 811. But our country, we have the population density of 1150. So how big the problem we face. So why this Mujib Climate Prosperity Plan, and we have 6 points there, looking into all the issues to address. The good thing is, vulnerable 55 country, out of these 37 country already expressed their intention to have the climate prosperity plan following this plan. And I understand if the developed country, they put their hands with them, then obviously it will be possible for them to have the much more well situation for survival. We used to tell the First World War, I was reading in an article, that the First World War transformed the energy to oil from coal. Second World War, it gave the nuclear. This war, Russia-Ukraine, we strongly believe it will bring back the renewable energy. If the commitment of the Climate Vulnerable Forum that 100% renewable energy, we Bangladesh, with our small resources, we are working for that. In our heart, we keep the call of our father of the nation. In Bangla, he called the whole nation in 1971 that dabaye rakhte parba na, none can resist us. We believe that together we can achieve more. Secretary General of UN, he told that this could be a lost decade. We need to work together to disprove his proposition that it is not a lost decade. So, jointly combating the net zero, looking into the Russia-Ukraine war, climate vulnerability, and working together. Thank you very much.
Thank you. One of the things I love about my job is that every day is a school day, and I've learned quite a lot from that, not least that who knew that if you pile the entire population into the States, you'd get 811, I guess that's, not sure the units, but people per unit area. And it's 1,150 in Bangladesh right now. That is, I mean, I knew it was a densely populated country, but that really brings it home. The other thing I take away from your talk, Abul, is just the relentless optimism and the focus on solutions. It's wonderful. We had Nasheed here for, I think, our first World Forum over a decade ago. And it was, in a sense, a bleak forward look at that point. But the Climate Vulnerable Forum is tackling this with a kind of honor and dignity that actually you don't always get in the West, being part of the solution. 6.5 million solar home systems. There aren't that many of them here. Anyway, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. I wonder if you could, you've put the wars in context. I like that. The first, the second, and now this war is going to trigger a shift to renewables. You're very aligned with Mary, I think, there. If there's one action you could ask somebody in this room to take, or indeed if there's one action that you think in Bangladesh or other climate vulnerable countries you can take as a result of the current window, what is the big intervention that might affect the most change and deliver the most prosperity for your group of nations?
I will try to draw your attention on the specific intervention of renewable energy. Different countries have different types of sources from renewable energy. So the Europe wind is more prominent, but unfortunately last year in winter, wind did not flow properly. So why the Europe faced problem with the energies. But again, if we put more wind, harnessing more wind energy and translating that into hydrogen fuel, that will be able to solve the problem of Europe. And if you have your own resources, then we, the developed country, we can buy energy with less cost. So I think the solution for the whole globe is renewable energy that gives own strength for each of the country. At the same time, carbon emission becomes less and it helps net zero. It helps net zero by 2050. But you see, The last year when IPCC 6 report was there, it's a devastating situation. The globe predicted what would happen in 2050 in terms of the global warming. It is coming down to 2030. So we need to work more quickly, more fast with a specific decision. That is the solution, is renewable energy.
Great. Thank you very much again, and I look forward to coming back to the discussion. So we're going to shift gear a little bit now. Lord Deben, former Conservative Party chairman, and of course chair of the Committee on Climate Change. The floor is yours to say whatever you like, really. I have lots of questions for you. He's just very interesting all the time, actually. So let me just shut up. You take it away, John.
Well, thank you. I want to start by suggesting that we've been living under 3 delusions since the fall of the Berlin Wall. The first was that we'd never have another war in Europe. The second was that we would always be able to get food without difficulty. And the third was that there was no worry about energy because there was plenty of it. And I remember being interviewed by the cleverest man in Europe, Peter Jay, as Minister of Agriculture, I suppose nearly 30 years ago. And he said to me, there's no need to have a Minister of Agriculture because we don't need to grow any food here because there's plenty of food in the world that we can buy. I don't understand what this is. And David Miliband saying, as being in effect the Minister of Agriculture, saying we don't have any plans for food security. This government doesn't think that's a necessary thing. And I really raise these things because we've suddenly woken up to the realities of life. And if I may say so, they are the permanent realities of life. This is what has featured always. We've always had wars in Europe, and we have always had a question about food, and we've always had questions about energy. And those ridiculous people who took us out of the European Union, of course, had forgotten that it was the most effective way of bringing the countries of Europe to learn to live together. And learning to live together means that you actually have to listen to other people. And that is why I enjoyed so much what you had to say about the developing world. And so it seems to me that what we've got to face at this moment is a series of complex mechanisms to ensure that what you said is actually going to be true rather than the fears which the chairman put forward. The what about? And the first of these things I think we have got to learn is the narrative. We've got to learn to be much better at explaining what this is all about. And that means 3 small but important changes. First of all, we've got to stop speaking in a language which everyone else doesn't understand. I've banned the phrase kilowatt hour in the Climate Change Committee because I don't know what it means because I can't feel it or touch it or anything. It doesn't mean anything. So don't ask me. So you've got to talk about bills. How much does it cost you? Now that, of course, leads on to the second one, is that you've actually got to talk about it in language which people themselves understand and connect with. And we shouldn't be in this argument of having some of the sillier people putting forward the argument that because of the Ukraine war and the energy supply problems and above all the cost of living crisis, then we're going to have to put off net zero. Now, there are, of course, 2 fundamental reasons why that isn't true. One is that we are in no position to put off net zero, because what we have done is to allow climate change to take over the timetable. That's the thing we have to learn. But the second reason is that it really isn't logical, because the things that we have to do for net zero, as you rightly said, are the same things that we have to do for the cost of living crisis. They are the same things. I mean, what more ludicrous concept is it to say, because gas is so expensive, we ought to get some more gas? It doesn't seem to me to be logical. because this is to miss the fact that the price of gas is actually an internationally fixed price. So we can frack as much as you blooming well want to, but it'll be at the same price as we're having to pay elsewhere. So it doesn't make sense to suggest that that is the answer to the cost of living crisis. Now, you can argue, although it's not all that easy to argue, but you can argue that for energy security reasons, you might want to do things that which, although they wouldn't meet the cost of living crisis, might be important. And I'm very careful in the Climate Change Committee not to go in for mission creep. So we try to talk about the issues from our point of view and accept that governments have to take other things into account. But what one does have to say is that for the cost of living, we have to go on and on and on about the lowest cost generation, which is onshore wind, then offshore wind. And of course, more difficult simply because of the climate, although after the last 3 months, I'm not sure that's going to go on being true, photovoltaics. And we have to go on about it because people have got to recognise that this is actually the mechanism by which you both reduce the cost of living, that you also reduce the dependence on other people, and that you also make the change as far as climate change is concerned. Which brings me to the third thing, which we have to be very careful about the narrative, and that is, I am tired of people talking about carbon. Because I don't think anybody knows what carbon is either. I don't think it means anything to people. What we have to say is that we have organised the world in such a way as we are changing our climate, and look what it was like this year for most people in Britain, but that was a darn sight better than it was in Pakistan. The trouble is, of course, that you see the films from Pakistan underwater, and after all, it was a horrific, not just effect, but area. I mean, 2/3 of the countries. It's an inconceivable thing. We have a small flood in the north of England, and we think the world has come to an end. But here is Pakistan in this terrible situation. But it is because of the constant movement of news, we've forgotten about it, actually. And we forget about our own floods unless it happens to you. And perhaps the most important thing of the last 3 months is that it happened to everybody. They did realise. What we've got to do is to turn that into language which people can actually take on. So I want to say to people, with just over 1 degree extra warming, we had a summer like that. My little organic farm looked like Serengeti for the first time. The pond, which was dug by my predecessor, a vicar, in 1880 to be a swimming pool. I must say I've never swum in it, but it was dug by him for the very first year ever, has no water in it. And people know that. And we have to bring that home, and we have to point out that at the moment we're in the direction of having 3 times as much warming as that has happened. But we have to bring that to people's own understanding. So I want to make sure that we change the narrative. I want also to be much more disruptive. And that is one of your themes. So I'm often asked, what do I think about the extreme campaigners? And of course, like everybody else, I admire their aims and don't like their mechanisms, partly because their mechanisms put people off and it's very difficult. On the other hand, I found when I was Secretary of State for the Environment that Greenpeace was my biggest ally, because we were doing quite well on environment compared with our opposition. The Labour Party at that time was not very interested in it, didn't do it very well. So we were doing very well, and the Cabinet used to say, well, we're not doing very well on anything else. We're doing that very well. Why do you want to do more? And it was Greenpeace that was extremely helpful, because I could point to Greenpeace and say, we've got to get a bit towards that. And The disruption of the extreme is very important, although having had a meeting yesterday entirely disrupted by Mr. Piers Corbyn from the other direction, it doesn't help if you don't let people actually speak, which is another thing. But
Not if you're disrupting, not if you're being disrupted. Yeah.
But there's another sort of disruption which I think that all of us have to be involved in, and I've started it myself, so I shall admit this. I am beginning to try to take individuals to task. So I've written to the chairman of Shell. I've said, you want to extend what you're doing in the North Sea. There are good arguments for that, but you've got to meet our requirements. You're not meeting the requirements that the Climate Change Committee has set for you to do that in the cleanest possible way. And you've told us that you still want to do it. I'm sorry, you have got to do it according to those stats. I've written to the chairman in Britain of ExxonMobil, a company of which I am particularly displeased. By the way, I hope nobody ever buys any ExxonMobil products. No environmentalist should ever do that. They have done more damage to the world than any other company. And that's why we shouldn't ever do that. And if you're running an institution and you need oil, it's not from them. Right. But I've written to him to say, so you're building a new pipeline from the port to Heathrow to carry aircraft fuel. It's evidently 147% bigger than the one you've got at the moment. The one you've got at the moment has lasted for 35 years. Your one can't last for 35 years because we're not going to be using that in Heathrow in 35 years' time. Will you explain to me what you are saying to your shareholders about this investment? I support the courts in stopping the campaigners from interfering with you building that pipeline, but I want to know how you are justifying it financially. I want all of us to become much more disruptive. It's not about businesses, it is about people. How do people sit in chairs and do these things? We have to shame them, and we have to make it clear it is their responsibility. It is not Exxon's responsibility that they lied about the knowledge that they had. It's Lee Raymond's personal responsibility as well. So I want us to be disruptive by really bringing home to people their responsibility and then doing the other half, which is to say thank you. We are very bad at saying thank you to the people who get it right, and we need to do that too, because if we don't do that, we can't take the next step, which is to say, now you've got that right, we want something more. And one of the problems with the green movement in this country and elsewhere is that it doesn't know the word thank you. All it does is to say you haven't gone far enough. That doesn't actually work. And my third point I want just to raise at this moment is, you may have been surprised at that second one, but it is really about the hugely important fact that we have to give people the belief that they can do something about it, that they have to do something about it, and that it's not for someone else. When I used to canvass when I was in politics, people used to say, oh, Mr. Gummer, somebody ought to do something about it. And I used to say, well, when are you going to start? Because that's what we have to say. And we have to be very careful about institutionalizing all this. It's about individuals making sure the institutions work. And very often, I'm not going to do it with this audience because it's unfair, I just say to the audience, will you put your hands up, those who've actually been in touch with your Member of Parliament in the last month?
Why don't we do that? I'm a fan of people putting their hands up, or not, most likely, as the case may be. Has anybody been in touch with their MP in the last month? There was a couple of hands, so that's impressive. I thought it was very well done. So 4 of you straight to the top of the class.
Something like 92% of you have let us down.
Me too.
Because the point is that unless these people recognise every week in their surgeries that this matters, they get caught up in the simplistic answers. Because none of them have ever read the stuff that most of us had to read. That's the problem. They don't read, they don't know. They haven't watched even the telly. They haven't watched big oil versus the world. Unless you bring it home to them as a constituent, as an individual, you're not going to get them to do what they now have to do, which is to take on that narrative and speak it to their constituents and do what you wanted them to do, which was actually to hold the line on Ukraine, hold the line on climate change, hold the line on recognising that we have to live down those 3 illusions: no war in Europe, no difficulty with food security, and no difficulty with energy security.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Lord Deben. Whether or not you went far enough, I would like to say thank you for being so disruptive, actually, to this panel. But now we have an opportunity for all of us to disrupt this panel. It's Q&A time. You know what that means. I'd like to collect lots of questions. You've had a smorgasbord of different ideas and expertise across the stage here. I mean, to be honest, we could spend the next 20 minutes with me asking questions, but I feel that's slightly unfair, and you'd probably get bored of me. John's point about ridiculous people and Brexit and silly people, I'm conscious that our current Prime Minister was educated just across the parks there in Merton. The previous one was educated where we're going to have... Well, that's true, but yeah, she's... so I'm wondering whether... Anyway, no, I won't go there. I could talk to you about the Conservative Party, but let's take some questions from the floor instead. Goodness me, 1, 2, and 3 up the front there. So collect this side first. 4, yes, I'll spot that. So in the corner, please.
Hi, thank you. Angela Francis, Director of Policy Solutions from WWF. So I'll start with a thank you to the panel. Thank you for all your work on the environment. I was a former FCO staffer, so recognise that's an important area. Big fan of all the Committee on Climate Change work. I loved the vulnerable communities perspective, having worked in Trinidad. I know the AOSIS community is part of negotiations, a very powerful moral voice, and you gave us that, and always great to hear that from IEA in terms of the positive side of the energy transition. So my question is on the sort of geopolitical side of this. When people talk about energy security and food security, they're often using it as a synonym for self-sufficiency rather than as sustainability. And we've seen over lots of political sort of moves in the last couple of years, this nativist tendency, which takes us away from global solutions and into sort of isolation. What do you say in response to the people who are kind of talking about those self-sufficiency solutions when most of the climate solutions we know we want are about international cooperation and solidarity with the most vulnerable? How do you respond and how do you combat that? Do we need to combat it?
Fabulous question, Angela. So energy security is not energy independence, commonly misunderstood. Thank you for the question. Let's pick up another one, another 2. So here at the front, Vicky, just right here. Yeah, thanks. We'll move from the front back.
Thank you very much for those presentations. My name's Mark Willers. I'm a barrister, now KC rather than QC, as of last
Does that
week.
change immediately, does it?
It changes immediately on the death of the
I
Queen.
didn't
Yes.
realise
So
that.
I quite like the QC, but I'm not so keen on the KC. There we are. I heard Alok Sharma talk about disruption, and he immediately talked about innovation. But I'm really glad to hear Lord Deben talking about disruption in more traditional ways, and as a barrister representing climate activists, so that's kind of what my game is. What I wanted to ask was this: what pressure can we put upon the international financial organisations such as the World Bank, who, as I understand it, are funding fossil fuel development, exponentially. It seems to me that we need to get to the head of World Bank, and perhaps Lord Deben will write one of those letters that he's been sending out to the likes of Shell and ExxonMobil. But I think that we need to really cut off that supply of ready money, and I wondered what the panel thought of that.
Great, super. So the supply of cash via the MDBs, and perhaps a letter coming to David Malpass. Let's go up the back to Lawrence next.
Good morning, Lawrence Wainwright. I'm the course director of the Master's Program in Sustainability, Enterprise and Environment here at the University of Oxford. So to get ourselves out of this mess and to tame these complex, non-linear, wicked problems and to navigate these turbulent, uncertain, novel, ambiguous times, we will by definition require leadership. Leadership from individuals, from organisations, from nation states. Lately, however, we've seen a distinct lack of leadership around the world, including many examples of do as I say, not as I do. What does leadership towards net zero and sustainable development look like? And where does it need to come from?
Great. Okay, so 3 questions. Let's do and very well done, audience. They were fairly quick questions, and we want nice, quick replies too. Leadership. Perhaps Judith, you could start us off with leadership. If you've had a bit of a life's experience in leaders. What have you learned?
All sorts of different types of leaders. I mean, my sense on this is actually, this is really the first time that we have seen some political leadership on this. Prior to this, it has been civil society that has really driven this forward, and activists. And this is the first time that we've really seen, and I have to give credit to Alok Sharma for his leadership of COP26, working with John, where actually I don't think we've seen a presidency that really got out there and pushed the agenda, really pushed the agenda, the miles he's put in, the effort he has put in, to really go out there and drive this, but not only to drive the agenda forward, but coming back to my earlier point in my sort of opening remarks, it's that listening piece and really understanding. It's fine as a G7 country to say this is how thou shalt do things, but the reality in other countries such as Bangladesh and Pakistan is very, very different. So I think we need to see more of that. I think what worries me a little bit is that we're losing some of the grassroots leadership. And this comes back to John's point on narratives. And language that connects with people. I'm currently serving in Sweden. Now, you would think the Green Party is a bit of a slam dunk in Sweden. We've just had elections. They just scraped back into Parliament. They got 5% of the vote. They needed 4% to breach the threshold. The votes that gave them that 5% did not come from the younger generation. They came from the older generation lending their votes to make sure that the left bloc got through. The younger generation turned right. Now, I'm sure that's partly how you rebel in a socialist country. You vote right of centre. But there was a narrative involved. The far-right Sweden Democrat Party picked up a lot of young votes in Sweden. One of their most successful campaigns was using TikTok and saying, if you vote for us, we'll make sure your diesel is much cheaper for your old clapped-out cars that your parents have given you. That resonated. That was tangible, that made sense. That was far easier to digest than a more amorphous or intangible narrative put forwards by a Green Party or by some of the other parties. So I think the leadership comes from getting the narrative right, but actually not assuming that those who have previously supported and driven this agenda are going to continue to do so, because the political tectonic plates are shifting.
So that's a fascinating set of remarks. Sitting as you are next to a former UK minister and secretary indeed on the environment, and saying that we haven't had any political leadership on the environment until now, I thought was a strong statement.
No. I didn't say environment. I didn't say environment. I'm talking about globally on climate change, and that is very fundamentally different.
Well, I was just trying to wind you up.
No. But I just before I get stabbed with a natural pen. But globally.
Yes.
I actually think that this is the first time we have had a really concerted global push to take things forward. And that will be the challenge for the COP27 presidency, because there will be a tendency to say, let's just implement what we've got and stick with what we've got. What we need is to keep the momentum going forwards. And that
Great.
takes time.
That's why you're the ambassador. You just brilliantly deflected. But leadership by TikTok, that's a new concept. John, I'd love to see a bit of that from you. The letter writing, you could have a TikTok campaign as well. But actually, you asked a very direct question by Mark Casey about the head of the World Bank and the multilateral development banks. I'm not sure the World Bank's necessarily the worst of the offenders on this front, but that's another whole conversation. Are these key leverage points? If so, are you someone who could start to pull the lever?
Well, first of all, on the World Bank, it is absolutely outrageous that the chairman of the World Bank refused to accept the question.
Yes.
Did he believe that climate change was happening because of human intervention? He avoided that the whole time and kept on telling us about what the World Bank was doing. I don't think that it's possible. If you deny human intervention in climate, then that's the equivalent of saying that Battle of Hastings didn't happen in 1066. I mean, I'm sorry, this is not a matter any longer of argument. And therefore one does have to say about leaders that if they don't accept the facts, then how can you trust them on any other decision, leave alone climate change? If he's making decisions on other things, if he's prepared to use his personal views, it's not surprising that Donald Trump was the person who chose him as the candidate.
Correct, and that's actually, if I may, that's what I was going to say. It's to be fair to many of the wonderful people in the World Bank, I have a phone full of commentary on the World Bank president from his own people that he may not wish to read. He was a Trump appointee. The institution is different from the person heading it. Dare I make that point very clear about the Smith School as well. And it may not be quite entirely fair to tar the whole bank with the brush of...
Well, I'm certainly not doing that. I was specifically taking the individual. As I said myself, I just think we have to take these individuals and remind them. I mean, there are far too many individuals in this world who are in powerful places, who are fond of taking the advantages of those powerful places, but don't like it when they actually have their feet put to the fire and saying, what are you doing about it? In that remarkable sermon by the Archbishop of Canterbury, which was an extraordinarily good balance of teaching the Christian gospel but bringing it home to people sitting in that funeral, there was a very interesting comment about service and about leadership and about the contrast between some and others, and I hope it got home to some of those whom I think it was meant to be pointed at. But the truth is, leadership starts by, I mean, it's so noticeable, by doing what you ask other people to do. That's what this whole recent issue was about. You ask people to do something if you're George VI and you have the same little amount of water in your bath as everyone else. When you're Ted Heath and you have a 3-day week, you don't have the lights on in the political part of number 10 for those days which no one else has the lights on. You know what leadership is. It's about, first of all, walking the walk. And that, to me, is the crucial damage of the leadership that we have had in this country, and it's what we shall be looking for to see that it doesn't happen anymore.
Yep, without even going in.
Self-sufficiency. We're going to be very short of food all throughout the world. I do think we have a duty to try to produce what we can do at home. I don't think that's a contrary thing, but I quite agree. You've got to be very careful that this doesn't all end up in an autarkic approach to life altogether. And if I may say so, we've got to produce it in a way which doesn't destroy the soil in any more than the planet. And I'm passionate. I'm a small organic farmer myself, small anyway, but small organic farmer. And I just want to say that sort of way, regenerative farming, is what we've got to do if we're going to regenerate the soil upon which we depend.
Very good point. I was actually going to hand Mary Angela's excellent question about energy independence, energy self-sufficiency. Presumably you strongly agree at the IEA.
Right, and if I may, just before I come to that, and at the risk of stepping into an issue that I know is quite rather controversial, the whole issue of financing, multilateral bank financing. If we had a room full of African energy ministers right now, you'd be hearing quite a different message, I think, which is they desperately need financing to develop their energy resources. And they're feeling the pain of some of these recent decisions. Now, there's a good reason to be advocating for no financing new oil and gas projects, but it is a subject that I think we need to be cognizant of in terms of different views across the world. And as we go into COP27, which is very much going to be an Africa COP, it's something for us to be thinking about, I think, in terms of our messaging. How do we help, and perhaps you can come in on this a little later as well, ensure that the emerging and developing world is able to continue to meet its energy needs, and the progress being achieved on access to electricity in a country like Bangladesh is fantastic, but there's still so much more that needs to be done across Africa. And then just segueing back to this whole issue of self-sufficiency versus sustainability. Yes, I think this current crisis, which is clearly global in nature, has underscored, made it very clear just how interdependent this world is. And while countries need to look after their own energy needs, no question, I think one thing that's become abundantly clear is the importance of diversification, right, in terms of meeting our needs. Some countries very obviously heavily dependent on the one source, Russian gas in particular, now understanding that was not in their energy security interests, and now quickly moving to diversify in many terms, stepping up, yes, their investments in renewables and clean energy, but also understanding that the need to be, to the extent they're still importing and such, looking at a range of suppliers from around the world. So, and no question, of course, the impacts go far beyond meeting energy security needs to the global food insecurity and other impacts this has had. So I think it's quite clear.
And Abul, I'd like just to give you a moment to pick up on any of those three questions or any of the comments there. I'm going to disrupt the flow of this panel shortly because we have 5 minutes left. It's traditional and normal for a chair to ensure that their panel members get a kind of summing up comment. I'm going to not do that, if that's okay. So after you've had a little reflection on what you've heard, Abul, I'm going to go back to the audience to collect a set of comments and questions and just leave them hanging for the coffee break. How about that? Let's see how that works. There's probably a reason nobody does this. We'll find out. We'll find out why. But Abul, what are your thoughts?
So when I was a kid, I used to go fishing, and I drank water taking from the river. Can I do it now? Impossible. Even I cannot bath in the rivers. The experts, the support of the multilateral development banks, what did they do? Okay, you need to produce more food, put embankments. Embankment was there. No water entering into the paddy field. What happens? The silt, 2 billion tons of silt from Himalayan come to our country. So it is now depositing on the bed of the river. No water enters into the crop fields. So the crop fields are not being charged with water, not being charged with that silt that is very fertile. Now what happened? Now it is the hybrid crops, insecticides. So all these are polluting the river. Now even we cannot bath in the river. It happens. Now we need to look into, the question comes that do as I say, don't do what I do. We need to turn around. What happens now with this disruptive situation? Now, so many countries in Europe, they are reopening their coal-fired power plant. They are reopening their nuclear power plant. But vis-a-vis, in my country, where we are suffering with the energy crisis, last year our government scrapped 10 coal-based power plants. So we are living in the same world. We are on the same boat. If you emit 1 unit of carbon here, that reflects all over for you and for me also. We need to keep that in mind. And keeping that, my same voice, renewable, renewable, and renewables. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Right, one last round of comments/questions. Keep them quick. I want to have as many as possible. Let's start here with John.
Thanks. It's John Merton, Cabinet Office in the UK. It's a response to the question from the KC about what can we do to push MDBs to lend money in the right places. One of the least reported but most valuable outcomes of COP26 was the Clean Energy Transition Partnership, which internationalised a policy approach that the UK adopted in March 2021, where we said that we would not use UK public funds in support of fossil fuels overseas. And 36 countries signed up to that at COP26, including essentially all of Western Europe, less Norway, Canada, the US, and a number of African countries as well. And that helps make sure that lending is for renewables, because actually the problem is not that there's not enough money going into renewables, because too many of the international banks are putting their money into fossil fuels. And if we can internationalise that clean energy transition partnership further and ensure that our governments don't resile from it in the face of the Russia-Ukraine crisis, that will be a really significant step in shaping lending decisions in the World Bank and others if we use our voting rights accordingly.
Great, super comment. One or two comments here, Richard, and then this side of the room's got a fairly raw deal, so we'll move over there.
Richard Howard, I'm the Research Director at Aurora Energy. I had a question for Lord Deben. Lord Deben, you mentioned how, in response to the energy crisis, cost of living crisis, we should focus less on gas and more on the cheapest form of energy, renewables in your mind. I thought you were going to take us down an angle on the cheapest energy we don't use, and we should push energy efficiency more. Which I know you're totally on board with that message, and the CCC is very on top of that. But what I sense is that the current administration in the UK and 3 previous ones is almost an ideological opposition to the idea of government doing more on energy efficiency. We don't see this in other countries. Europe is massive on this, Ireland is massive on this, but in the UK we somehow don't get it. I'd be interested in your views, also in the spirit of leaving things hanging. That we have lots of other people in the room who, particularly from the media, why does this issue not get cut through with politicians here? What can be done to change that? Super question, and I see Anne-Marie Lovin's just moving his way to into a better position there, perhaps the expert on the negawatt globally. I was talking with someone from Channel 4 yesterday about could we make a massive global campaign around insulating things, get into the public consciousness. Anyway, thank you. So pick that up in the break. I think let's have a few questions here. Yes, please.
Will Wells, technology entrepreneur. You all mentioned an innovation gap. You all mentioned the need for technology. How do we balance focus, funding, and incentives with long-term breakthroughs like direct air capture, hydrogen fuel for aviation, synthetic protein at scale, with the absolute need for renewables tomorrow? How do we break down those barriers through the means that I suggested, and how do we balance the long term versus the short term?
Great, long versus short term on innovation. The Smith School will have a paper actually out in January next year on innovation in the energy system, thinking about some of these long and short term issues, but very good question. We're kind of out of time, so unless I see a desperate hand, was that a hand, Julian? It was a hand, yes. So one last question.
Thanks. Julian Milcrease from Bank of America. 2 comments, really. One, in terms of the whole security of energy and managing the transition at the same time. When I think about it, you look at it on 3 different time horizons. It's clear 10 years plus. We're doing it faster. It's clear for the next 3 to 5 years, maybe security is kind of trumping that transition. The real question for me is the next 5 years, and what are we actually going to do in years 5 to 10? Because that, I think, is unclear to me, because I don't think things will move fast enough to transition fast enough, and that probably means you're going to have more things like gas flowing into Europe for longer, which then I guess to my question, for me, I think we will need to be talking as much, not just about greening, but also decarbonising, because we're probably living with whether we like it or not, with maybe that fossil fuel system for longer, and I think that's something we all need to embrace without feeling uncomfortable about it. So.
And another tricky one. Well, look, I'm sorry, panel, for leaving you hanging there. I hope you don't mind. But the foyer is there. We're there. We're going to move out for coffee in just a moment. We'll be back here at 11:30. But before we do that, please join me very heartily in thanking what was an excellent set of discussions and remarks. Thank you very much, Judith. Thanks, John, Mary, and Abul. Thank you.